I want to first thank Susan and Kate and the Atlanta History Center for having me, and particularly thank John Golden and the Livingston Foundation for their great support. As Susan said, I'm here to talk about my new book, Lighting Out for the Territory, How Samuel Clemens Headed West and Became Mark Twain, which has just been published by Simon & Schuster. This book covers the 6-year period that Samuel Clemens lived out west during and immediately after the Civil War. This was the period that he really discovered his true calling as a writer and devised the famous pen name under which he wrote. We all have a mental image of Mark Twain as an old man in a white suit, smoking a cigar and looking wise. In his early years that I'm writing about, he was still a red-headed wise guy, sort of a real-life Tom Sawyer who was always getting into trouble and then talking or walking his way out of it. He was always on the verge of lighting out for somewhere else, and before he permanently stopped lighting out in April of 1910, he had visited 5 continents, gone around the world twice, personally crossed the Atlantic Ocean 29 times, and lived abroad for 14 years. Travel, he said, was liberalizing. Whenever you write a book, the first thing people want to know is why. I always hope they mean, why did you write this particular book, not why did you write this particular book. In the case of Mark Twain, he really combines 2 of my major interests, which are Civil War history and American literature. As we'll see, Twain really combined these 2 only very briefly, but everyone's got to start someplace. And having written previously on Ambrose Bierce and Walt Whitman, the only 2 other prominent American writers who actually fought in the Civil War or experienced the Civil War and lived to tell about it, I saw Mark Twain as kind of the next logical choice. It would turn out to be a much funnier and wilder experience than I thought. I wanted to call my book A Connecticut Yankee in Bankruptcy Court. I borrowed that title from a fellow graduate student of mine at the University of Tennessee, but really didn't have anything to do with this current book, so I couldn't use it. Instead, I call it Lighting Out for the Territory, which is a title I borrowed from Huckleberry Finn instead. Ernest Hemingway, who was never particularly generous when talking about other writers, liked to say that all American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's the best book we've had. Critics sometimes debate the second part of Hemingway's equation, but he was absolutely right about the first part, I think. Mark Twain was really the first American writer to write in the way that Americans really speak, which is free and easy, and you can hear his famous Missouri accent in everything he wrote. Before Mark Twain came along, American writers were really dominated, American literature was dominated by writers living in New England, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Greenleaf Whittier, who really wrote and sounded like aristocratic Englishmen. And Twain sounded like nobody but himself, and a seemingly easy but actually very difficult thing to do. He was also the first writer of prominence to come from the American frontier. He of course grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, and his time when he spent out in the Wild West, which is sort of the subject of my book, was really the thing that really made him a truly transcontinental figure. And without his experiences in the West, I think he would have probably just been another local color humorist, sort of witty and amusing, but not particularly noteworthy in the larger scheme of things. Instead, by opening himself up to the wider experiences of what Robert Frost wrote was the land vaguely realizing westward, Twain really opened the door for other American writers to follow in his truly trailblazing footsteps, and these footsteps really started in the West. He was born, of course, Samuel Clemens in Florida, Missouri, in November 30th, 1835, and grew up a few miles away in Hannibal on the banks of the Mississippi River. He liked to claim that his birth was heralded by the arrival of Halley's Comet. As usual, he was stretching the truth. The comet actually arrived several weeks before Twain did. But he always identified with Halley's Comet and really took a proprietary interest in it. And he managed to die exactly 75 years later when the comet made its next appearance. This April 21st will actually mark the 100th anniversary of his death, the reports of which are no longer, as he once said, exaggerated. Twain's father died when he was 11, and he went to work as an apprentice printer in his brother Orion's newspaper, the Hannibal Journal. Orion spelled his name Orion, but for some reason pronounced it Orion, and their sister spelled her name Pamela, but pronounced it Pamela. For some reason, Samuel did not pronounce his name Samuel. I don't know why. It probably would have worked just as well. I'll simply call him Mark Twain to avoid jumping back and forth, although it took a few years for that name to catch on. Orion Clemens was 10 years older than his brother and had a habit of paying his newspaper employees in what Mark Twain said were uncashable promises. Twain found himself doing a lot of work for little money, so he looked for other ways to amuse himself. And once, when Orion was out of the office, he typeset a huge streamer headline that said, "Terrible accident, 500 men killed or missing." Local residents living on the Mississippi River were used to such disasters happening pretty regularly, and they may have missed the smaller type at the bottom of the page that said, "We had set the above headline expecting to use it, but the accident hasn't happened yet. So we'll just say to be continued." Journalism was never a sacred calling for Mark Twain. Twain left home at the age of 17 to take a better paying, which is to say paying, job at the St. Louis Evening News. And a few months later, he went to New York to see the World's Fair. One of his old Hannibal neighbors was exhibiting there. He considered the World's Fair disappointing, but he was fascinated by P.T. Barnum's Wild Men of Borneo, a pair of twin dwarfs that he actually saw exhibited in a cage on the sidewalk. He went to work at a New York printing press and told his mother that he spent his nights reading in the library. I find that a little hard to believe, but you know, you got to tell your mother something. He liked New York City well enough, except for the crowds, which were really a trial to a small-town boy like himself. He wrote to his mother, to wade through this mass of human vermin would try the patience of the most patient man who ever lived. And Mark Twain would never be that person. After knocking around in the East for a few years in New York City and Washington and Philadelphia, actually Twain went to Philadelphia from New York City because for some reason he thought it would be warmer there in the winter. I never really understood that reasoning, but that was what he said. And he came up with the bright idea of going to South America and importing coca, which he had read about was this marvelous new plant that gave people a lot of energy. So, but his would-be career as a pioneer drug lord kind of fell by the wayside like most of his other big ideas. And he was wondering what to do next, and he thought back. As a boy in Hannibal, he said everybody wanted to grow up to be a Mississippi riverboat pilot. So he actually went to New Orleans, and the only way you could become a pilot was to get a real pilot to train you. And so he hired an older pilot named Horace Bigsby and paid him $500, which he borrowed from his brother-in-law, to teach him about the Mississippi River. The first lesson didn't go very well. Bigsby was carefully explaining all the sandbars and the the various trouble spots and where to dock the boat. And he noticed that Mark Twain wasn't taking any notes. Twain said he thought he was just making conversation. Bigsby said, "Taking you by and large, you seem like more different kinds of an ass than anybody I've ever met." But Twain stuck with it and got his pilot's license in 1859, an achievement that he always considered the proudest moment of his life. And he thoroughly enjoyed being a pilot. He considered himself what he said was a good average pilot. And it may have been a little generous because in the 2 years that he was a pilot, he managed to wreck 3 riverboats, one by racing another boat at night in the fog. But he said he fully expected to follow the river the rest of my days and die at the wheel when my mission was ended. But then, as Abraham Lincoln would say a few years later, the war came, and everything changed overnight for Mark Twain and the rest of the country. The Mississippi closed down for commercial travel for the duration of the war, and Twain was deathly afraid that he'd be drafted into the Union Navy or the Confederate Navy, depending on who controlled that part of the river, and as he said, become a target for every Tom, Dick, and Harry on shore. So he left New Orleans and he went to St. Louis where his sister Pamela lived and spent several weeks hiding out. He was convinced that the entire Union Confederate Navy was searching for him and that he would be dragged off to serve on the ship. But after a few weeks of hiding, he went home to Hannibal to collect a debt that one of his friends owed him. And the friends talked him into joining a group of Confederate cavalry that they were forming called the Marion Rangers, which is named after the county that they lived in. The Rangers weren't exactly a crack military unit even for early in the war. They first thing they did was elect each other to the same rank of lieutenant because they didn't want anybody to outrank anybody else. Twain, with his massive military experience, thought that he should be the commander. Of course, he had no military experience, but the Rangers spent most of their time when they weren't arguing about rank, arguing about strategy and falling off their horses and retreating constantly from what they thought was the entire Union Army. One Ranger accidentally shot his own horse one day for not giving the proper password. Another got carried off by a farmer's bulldog, and the entire group fell down the hillside one night into a creek. Twain suffered a badly sprained ankle when he jumped out of a burning barn that he had set on fire in the first place by smoking in bed. And after about 2 weeks of marching and counter-marching, they did so much of it that one old farmer in the neighborhood said that they were bound to win the war all by themselves because no government could stand the expense of the shoe leather it would cost to chase them around. 25 years later, Twain wrote about his brief and rather inglorious Civil War career in an article entitled "The Private History of a Campaign That Failed." The dramatic climax of the article was what Twain described as the tragic killing of an innocent civilian by the Rangers one night. He said that this shooting had really soured him on the war, and he found that he wasn't really equipped for this awful business. That much was true, but the killing itself was totally made up. The Marion Rangers never killed anybody in their brief existence, either accidentally or on purpose, not even each other. But it gave Mark Twain a convenient excuse to retire from the Confederate Army. This was probably for the best. If he had stayed on, he might well have gotten himself killed. The Civil War was particularly nasty in Missouri when you had such stone-cold killers as Jesse James and Cole Younger and Bloody Bill Anderson and William Clark Quantrill riding around the countryside shooting anybody that got in their way, and they were on Twain's side. Still, he said later that he might have made a pretty good soldier if he had stayed in the Army because he already knew more about retreating than the man that invented retreating. He went back to St. Louis and was hiding out at his sister's house again. wondering, as was often the case with Twain, what he was going to do next. And his brother Orion arrived with the surprising news that he had been appointed secretary to the governor of Nevada Territory. He even had an official-looking piece of paper signed by Abraham Lincoln to prove it. And being Orion, that was all he had. Like the rest of the Clemens family, he was dead broke, and Mark Twain gladly offered to pay both their ways out west if Orion would just let him go along. So on July 25, 1861, the two brothers lit out for the territory from St. Joseph, Missouri, aboard a one-ton Concord stagecoach drawn by 6 horses and cushioned by leather shock absorbers that Twain said made the ride feel like a cradle on wheels. For 3 weeks, the brothers rode the stage across Nebraska, Utah, Colorado, and down into Nevada. They had the stage pretty much to themselves, which was a good thing because the first thing they did was strip down to their underwear and start smoking. This was, they said, made them feel comfortable and at home. They had also each brought along about 25 pounds of baggage, including dress shirts, dress suits, wool shirts, army shirts, boots, tobacco, pipes, matches, canteens, coins, and several boxes labeled acetous extract of lemon that they said should help them ward off scurvy. Twain brought along a tiny 7-shot revolver that he said fired a bullet about the size of a homeopathic pill. He said it would take all 7 shots to make a single dose. But he was ready, he said, for anything. Orion wasn't an ideal traveling companion. He got on his brother's nerves by endlessly whistling the same few bars of Roll On Silver Moon over and over again. And he insisted on bringing along a dictionary that Mark Twain said weighed 1,000 pounds and didn't even have any good words in it. Every time they went around the corner, the dictionary would bounce around the stagecoach and threaten to knock their head, their brains out. But they survived that, and the stagecoach stopped every 50 miles or so to take on passengers or change horses. And the brothers ate their meals at a communal table with the other drivers and the stock handlers. And the menu, said Twain, consisted invariably of bread, bacon, and vinegar, washed down by something called slumgullion, which he said pretended to be tea but actually had too much dish rag, sand, and old bacon rinds in it to deceive the intelligent traveler. At one stage station, Twain found himself face to face with a real-life gunslinger named Jack Slade, who worked for the stage line when he wasn't busy robbing it, and who carried around the ear of one of his victims as a good luck charm. Twain and Slade actually were reaching for the last cup of coffee, and Twain wrote later that Slade was about to take the last cup when he saw that my cup was empty and politely offered to fill it. I politely declined. I was afraid he hadn't killed anybody yet that morning and might be needing diversion. Well, Twain survived the confrontation, but a couple years later, Jack Slade was lynched by vigilantes in Montana for disturbing the peace, which, given the comparatively lax standards of the West, must have been a pretty big disturbance. The brothers continued on to Salt Lake City, where Orion was supposed to meet with Mormon leader Brigham Young in behalf of the Lincoln administration. Twain went along for the visit and said that Brigham Young, who had 17 wives himself, advised him to stop at a dozen. Take my word for it, Brigham Young said, 10 or 11 wives is all you need. Never go over it. Twain apparently took that advice to heart because a couple of years later, or a few years later, he married a young woman and was happily married himself for 34 years. He wasn't as impressed with Brigham Young's religion. The Book of Mormon, said Twain, was nothing more than chloroform in print. And he said that if Joseph Smith had actually written it, he had already performed a major miracle by staying awake while he did so. Anyway, after 21 days on the road, they arrived at their destination of Carson City, Nevada. They were met by a welcoming committee, a gunfight, and a windstorm in that order. It was pretty much a regular working day in Carson City. The welcoming committee took one look at the brothers who were covered in alkali dust from having just crossed the Great American Desert and melted away. And a local gunfighter named Jack Harris rode up and was greeting them to Carson City when he noticed the arrival of one of his mortal enemies. And as Mark Twain said, he began to rebuke the stranger with a six-shooter. After a brief gunfight, Harris rode away with several bullet holes in him, but nodded in a neighborly fashion as he left. And Twain said that, I never saw Harris shoot a man after that, but it reminded me of my first day in Carson City. A natural disturbance followed the gunfight. It was what was known as the Washoe Zephyr, which was a giant windstorm that swept down from the mountains around Carson City every day, and was, said Mark Twain, about the size of the United States, said edgewise. He said that inside the Zephyr you could find various items such as chickens, sagebrush, shingles, doormats, buffaloes, wheelbarrows, wagons, and assorted small children. It was really something to see, said Twain. Carson City was near the center of the Comstock Lode, which was the biggest silver strike in American history. And while Orion Clemens went to work for the government, Mark Twain decided he might just as well become a millionaire. So he set out prospecting around Lake Tahoe, and he marked out several promising claims, but wandered off one morning and left a frying pan in the campfire and burned the whole mountain down. He barely escaped with his life by rowing desperately across the lake, and he wrote to his mother and said, "This is the damnedest country you've ever seen." One day he took his pet dog Tom along with him when he went prospecting around Mono Lake, which was actually a dead sea on the Nevada-California border. Mono Lake had such a heavy alkali content that it was almost like bleach. And Tom the dog was covered with sores, and one day he jumped into the lake to get away from the flies. That was bad judgment, said Twain. In his condition, it would have been just as comfortable for him to have jumped into the fire. The alkali water nipped him in all the raw places simultaneously, and he struck out to shore with considerable interest. He finally struck out over the mountains at a gait we estimated at about 250 miles an hour, and he is going yet. Wherever he went, Twain failed at prospecting, probably because he expected to find the silver just sort of spread out on the ground, and, as he said, veneered on the rocks. Instead, he discovered that silver mining was actually a very hard process and involved a lot of hard work and digging holes and blasting ledges, and he quickly decided that was too much work for him. He wasn't any more cut out to be a miner than he was a cavalry soldier, so he was wondering what to do next. He was actually thinking about returning to the East, war or no war, and his luck finally changed when he was offered a job at the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise as a cub reporter, mainly as a favor to his brother because the Enterprise did the official government printing for the territory, and they figured it wouldn't cost them too much to give Twain a job. So he went to Virginia City, which was about 30 miles north of Carson City. And he actually was lucky because the Enterprise was the liveliest newspaper between St. Louis and San Francisco. And Twain fit right in. Besides assorted miners and gamblers and prospectors and other desert rats, the city was home to a contingent of prostitutes, which were known as hurdy-gurdy girls, and an entire regiment of gunslingers known as Sugarfoot Mike and Pockmarked Jake, Eldorado Johnny, and Six-Fingered Pete. These gunslingers, said Twain, were brave, reckless fellows who killed each other on slight provocation and hoped and expected to be killed themselves because they held it a shame to die with their boots on. Actually, his first day as a reporter, he was wandering around wondering what to report on, and he came upon a gunfight in a saloon. And according to him, of course, it's hard to tell fact from fiction with Mark Twain. One of the gunslingers shot the other one and shot and killed him. And Twain rushed up and shook his hand and said, "Oh, thank you. You really made my day. And if there's anything I can do for you, don't hesitate to ask. And now, if you could manage to get yourself hanged, it would really make the day perfect." The newspaper staff met every night at a saloon across the street called the Bucket of Blood, where they drank copious amounts of the local home brew, which was known as 40 Rod. Twain said it got its name because that was the approximate distance a tenderfoot could stagger before collapsing in a heap after drinking it. Another favorite drink was called chain lightning, and Twain said that consisted of galvanic batteries, hornets, pepper sauce, and vitriol. But he said proudly, he always managed to consume his daily allowance. Later, actually, Twain would prefer to drink a mixture of scotch and milk, and which sounds even worse than chain lightning. He spent 2 years working on the Enterprise, reporting the news, and when there wasn't any news to report, he would invent it. His mentor on the Enterprise was an older reporter named William Wright, who called himself Dandy Quill. And Dandy Quill told him that the real trick to being a reporter consisted of one piece of advice, which was first get the facts and then distort them as much as you want. Dandy Quill illustrated this point with a story that he wrote about an inventor who he said froze to death one day in Death Valley after his suit of water-cooled solar armor malfunctioned and left him covered in foot-long icicles. Twain took the advice to heart, and he contributed a story about a prominent local resident named Hopkins who, he said, went crazy one night from the heat and killed his wife and massacred his kids and rode into town and realized what he did and cut his throat in remorse. And it was a sensational story until people noticed that the Hopkins all seemed to be walking around perfectly healthy. So Twain ran a correction the next day in the newspaper. He said, "I take it all back." His habit of creative reporting finally got him into trouble one day when the editor of the rival Virginia City Union challenged him to a duel because Twain had reported that the Union newspaper wasn't supporting the Union cause vociferously enough. Twain, of course, had been a Confederate himself, but that didn't really seem to matter, except to the editor of the Virginia City Union, who insisted on fighting a duel. But Twain, as usual, preferred to avoid any kind of physical confrontation. He said he didn't have time to fight a duel just then, and besides, he had been drunk when he wrote the story in the first place. The editor persisted in challenging him, so Twain decided that the better part of valor was just to leave Virginia City. And so he moved to San Francisco in 1864, took a job on a newspaper there called the San Francisco Morning Call. He began what he called a daily earthquake almanac. A sample entry says, November 2nd, spasmodic but exhilarating earthquakes interrupted by showers of churches, buildings, and things. The problem was that the editor of the San Francisco Call actually expected him to do some real work. And Twain said that was awful slavery for a lazy man. And so after about 4 months as a reporter in the San Francisco Call, he quit his job and spent the next several weeks, as he said, dodging acquaintances and landlords. He said he felt lowlier than the worms and actually claimed that he considered committing suicide. And he said that he wasn't man enough to pull the trigger, and many times in his life he regretted not having pulled the trigger, but he was never sorry for having made the attempt. In lieu of killing himself, he went to a mining camp to visit friends in Calaveras County, and which was about 50 miles east of San Francisco. And there he heard apparently a favorite local story about a champion jumping frog that was filled with buckshot one day to trick a gambler and win a bet. And so Twain said, if I could write the story just the way it was told to me, that frog would jump all around the world. And it turned out he was right. His story, the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, caught on all across the country and was picked up in newspapers throughout the East. And so Mark Twain, actually like Lord Byron, he woke up one morning and found himself famous. Being Mark Twain, he still was dead broke, and he was wondering what to do next. So he went to Hawaii. They had just begun their first cruise ships to Hawaii. This was in 1866. And he spent 4 months of what he called luxurious vagrancy, bouncing around the Hawaiian Islands. He actually became one of the first mainlanders to try the sport of surfing, which, as you can imagine, Mark Twain on a surfboard, it didn't go too well. He said later that the surfboard struck the shore in 3/4 of a second without any cargo, and I struck the bottom about the same time with about two barrels of water in me. He spent the rest of his time closely observing the native hula dancers, purely for the sake of research, he said, and visited the site of Captain Cook's death at the hands of enraged islanders in 1779, which Twain said was justifiable homicide if I ever saw it, and hiked across the floor of an active volcano one day, and where he reported that the smell of sulfur was strong but not unpleasant to a sinner. He also gamely sampled the local food. The sour oval-shaped tamarinds he called aggravated peanuts. And he said they sharpened his teeth like a razor and put an edge on it that will likely wear off about the time the enamel does. He tried local apples, which he said were as good as bad turnips but no better. But he drew the line at eating poi, which was the local food stuff made of a gluey paste of the taro plant. This, said Twain, was a villainous mixture, almost tasteless before it ferments, and then too sour for luxury. A constant smoker himself, Twain was also unimpressed by the local cigars called Manilas, which sold for 10 for 25 cents. He said it would take about 1,000 to be worth the money. After you've smoked $35 worth, you feel like nothing so much as wanting to desperately go outside and smoke. So he returned to San Francisco from Hawaii. He was still broke and wondering what to do next. And someone suggested he rent a theater and give a lecture. He could actually charge people to hear him talk, which was something he'd been doing virtually nonstop all his life anyway. So Twain agreed and rented the Academy of Music in San Francisco. He set his debut date for October 2nd, 1866. He put an ad in the local newspaper that said, "Doors open at 7 o'clock. The trouble will begin at 8." Actually, his foray on the public stage was not as unlikely as it seemed. His mother, Jane, had always been fascinated by storytellers, and from early age he had gone to see preachers and politicians, actors, singers, Jim Crow dancers, blackface minstrels. The 19th century saw an explosion of traveling lecturers from respectable abolitionists like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass to a whole mob of wandering divines, faith healers, spirit knockers, temperance lecturers, abstinence promoters, health food advocates, and outright charlatans. He had met traveling performers in Virginia City, such as Artemus Ward, who became really one of his mentors. And they convinced him that really all you needed was a good act. So to ensure a proper reception for himself, Twain salted the audience the first night with old friends like Bret Hart, and he hired a local fireman named Bill Slauson, who had a great laugh, and he instructed, and he said he gave him minute instructions on how to detect indistinct jokes. At the appointed hour of 8 o'clock, Twain strolled on stage with his hands in his pockets, casually wandering about for a few minutes, and then appeared to notice the audience for the first time. He looked out at them with a mixture of fear, surprise, and irritation, and then announced in an exaggerated Missouri drawl, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of introducing to you Mr. Clemens, a gentleman whose numerous accomplishments and high moral character are only surpassed by his natural modesty and general sweetness of disposition." I refer, of course, to myself. Until he reached such a level of fame that he didn't need any introductions, Twain always preferred to introduce himself anyway. Once he violated his own rule and was introduced by somebody in Wilmington, Delaware, who reported that he was introducing the famous Mark Twain from the famous town of San Francisco with his famous lecture about the famous jumping frog from famous Calaveras County. This was so embarrassing, said Twain, that it put him in mind of a family member who had been hanged one day, and afterwards everyone said that the hanging went off very comfortably, but the sheriff's speech was a little annoying. Twain apologized for the absence of an orchestra, particularly since he was speaking at the Academy of Music. He said he wasn't accustomed to putting on an opera. He said he had engaged a trombone player to perform, but the man insisted on having other musicians come and accompany him, and said, "Twain, I hired the man to work, and I wasn't going to stand for such nonsense. I discharged him on the spot." So without further ado, he launched into his maiden speech. He began, "When in the course of human events," and took it from there. The topic of his lecture that night was our fellow savages of the Sandwich Islands. He said there had been 400,000 residents of the Sandwich Islands when Captain Cook discovered them, but that didn't last long. The white man, said Twain, brought in various complicated diseases and education and civilization, and consequently the local population began to drop off with commendable activity. Still, he said, Hawaiians were very hospitable. They would feast you on raw fish, coconuts, baked dogs, and fricasseed cats. They're particularly fond of baked dogs, said Twain, but that was all right with him since it's only our cherished American sausage with the mystery removed. As for the rumor that Hawaiians were cannibals, Twain adamantly denied it, but he offered to demonstrate the practice if anyone in the audience will loan me an infant. 90 minutes later, he left the stage to a standing ovation and had discovered a whole new calling for himself. He said later that in October 1866, I broke out as a lecturer, and from that day to this, I've always been able to gain my living without having to do any work. 2 months later, he left San Francisco for good and went back to New York City, 6 years into a trip that he had expected would last 3 months. In many ways, these were the most important years of his life. He had come west as Samuel Clemens, out-of-work Mississippi riverboat pilot, unemployed printer, and Confederate Army deserter. He was returning east as Mark Twain, renowned journalist, world traveler, and stage performer. He later wrote about his experience in a book called Roughing It, which offered a somewhat sanitized account of his adventures. In conclusion, I would quote what that noted philosopher Huckleberry Finn said a few years later, which was that Mr. Mark Twain told the truth mainly with some stretchers thrown in. Well, that ain't no matter, says Huck. I'd never seen anybody but lied one time or another. After all, you might say it went with the territory. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I enjoyed being here. Thanks a lot. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them, or either here or privately. But again, thank you so much, and thanks to the Livingston Foundation for having me, and for the Atlanta History Center for having me, and allowing me to share a little bit about Mark Twain. So thanks again. Thanks a lot. It's always an issue with somebody like Mark Twain, who I said in my book, you know, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So you try to kind of double check. One thing that I found was valuable was to just his letters are collected, and the letters that he wrote home were not intended for publication. And of course, then he wasn't even famous yet, so you can really get kind of an insight into what kind of a person he was. And he was really kind of a cantankerous kind of guy. He wasn't the lovable, grandfatherly character that we all sort of envision him as. He was I get the impression he was always a bit of a handful to deal with. I know one thing I always say is that I was surprised to see that he had no sense of humor about himself. He loved as long as he was telling the jokes, but if he became the butt of a joke, he got really mad. And when he went back to Virginia City after he first became famous, some of his old friends at the saloons decided it would be a funny joke to rob him one night. So they put on bandanas and held him up and took his watch and his money and left him standing in his underwear. And the next day they went to his hotel room to give him his money back and explain that they were really the robbers. And they figured he'd have a good laugh about it. And he actually got so mad that he canceled the rest of his speaking tour and went back to San Francisco and fired his tour manager. So he didn't have much of a sense of humor when it came to himself. Yes, ma'am?
How much education did he have?
He left school when he was 11. When his father died, he had to go to work, and so he only had a grade school education. I think working in all these newspapers as a printer and then as a reporter was really where he got his real education and his experience as a writer. Well, that's a good question. He actually, in Virginia City was sort of split, but it was mostly pro-union at the time because they were wanting to become a state and did become a state. But there was a contingent of pro-Confederates, and Twain he didn't really make a lot of noise about having been briefly in the Confederate Army himself. And after the war was over, he met Ulysses S. Grant and Sherman and several of the Union generals when he would give speeches, and he said he wanted to call the story I was referring to earlier, Private History of a Campaign That Failed. He wanted to call My Campaign Against Grant because he was convinced that Ulysses S. Grant had been in the same part of Missouri when he was. Actually, I think people have done research and shown that Grant didn't arrive in Missouri until a few weeks after Twain left, but he did. He published Grant's memoirs. This was when he had his own publishing company, Webster and Company, and Grant completed his memoirs just right before he died. And Twain said that he had the pleasure of giving Grant's widow the single largest royalty check to that point in American history. So. As he got older, he became more sort of respectable and something of a Republican, which was kind of unusual when you think of Mark Twain. But I know I did a book on the stolen election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, and Twain was a big Hayes supporter and actually gave one speech, but it was so bad that they asked him not to give any more speeches in behalf of I mean, I say so bad, I think it was just so truthful, and they were expecting, funny things. So long story to say that he met most of the Union generals. He didn't, perhaps not coincidentally, he never became friends with any of the Confederate generals after the war. I think, I don't know if they even were familiar with his his brief service, but he was at that time living in Connecticut and didn't see any of them anyway. I think he generally, when he performed, he was, you know, in his humorous Mark Twain vein. Of course, later he would write, as he got older, several unhumorous pieces. Particularly, he became a vociferous critic of the Spanish-American War at a time when most of the country was all for the war. So the older he got, the more serious he got. But I think in public, he always had the image of Mark Twain, the man in the white suit. So. Yeah, I think definitely he did, and he had an influence on performers too, because he was really the first popular performer who kind of it was sort of all about his sense of timing more than what he was saying. I know he said that one of the funniest, the biggest laughs he ever got, one night he just walked out on stage and didn't say anything. And he stood there for about 2 minutes, which is an eternity if you're on stage, and just looking at the audience. And finally, somebody kind of started laughing, and then the whole place fell apart. So he was really kind of a performance artist. He wrote a book called Life on the Mississippi, which is full of really hilarious. In fact, the story I told about is his first lesson with Horace Bigsby, and that's really a wonderful book to read, because it does go into a lot of detail about the Mississippi and being a riverboat pilot. And of course, even if the Civil War hadn't come along, the riverboats would have died out pretty soon anyway, because you know their days were numbered by the railroads and by the steamships. Yeah, he actually didn't start wearing his white suit until he moved to New York. Not right after this, but later in his life, because he said he was tired of trying to pick out a wardrobe. So he bought a white suit, and everybody suddenly started noticing him even more, and that was fine with him. So he went out and bought about a dozen white suits, and the only other thing he wore, I was talking earlier, he got an honorary degree from Oxford, and he had the whole gown and cap and everything. And for formal events, he would insist on wearing that. He actually wore it to his daughter's wedding, which made her pretty angry. There's a photograph of the bride and the groom and Mark Twain standing there in his Oxford gown. So. Right. His younger brother Henry, who was Mark Twain's favorite brother, he was closest in age. He was about 2 years younger than Mark Twain. Twain, after he became a riverboat pilot, talked Henry into joining him on the river. And so the two of them were working on the same boat, the Pennsylvania, and were sailing between New Orleans and Memphis. And Twain got into a fist fight with the captain one night, and they put him off the boat. And the next morning, the Pennsylvania exploded and killed about 150 people, including his brother Henry. So he was really devastated by that and felt personally guilty, because it was him that talked him into joining the riverboat in the first place. Okay, well, thank you so much again for your patience. I appreciate it.